Hello everyone and welcome to Module 7B. And we already covered assessments in general with a lot of information, so I thought it would be important to talk about formative assessments, which is something that you do in the classroom every day, if not every week. And I like to adapt it to all ages from pre-K to secondary. We will have two goals. Participants will learn a concrete way to design formative classroom assessments or review this new way and practice it. And secondly, participants will review and retell basic principles to keep in mind when planning for bilingual learners' assessments. There was a lot of information last week, so I thought we would take the time to zoom into some of the main principles. I'm using two main resources. One is Assessing English Language Learners, Bridges to Educational Equity by Margot Gotiliev, and the second is Jose Medina, some of his content during his Educational Solutions webinars. Gotiliev uses this philosophical principle that I like to share with you because it's mine as well, that assessments for bilingual learners should be reliable, valid, and meaningful, and that they should be gathered from multiple sources and perspectives, and this allows us to accrue evidence over time to make informed educational decisions. And each of these aspects or components of the philosophical principle is very important. You can pause and reread it and think of every single term. So once we set the context of our assessments for bilingual learners, we go into what is it that we measure. So a comprehensive assessment system for bilingual learners is a balance of three things: language proficiency and academic content standards, so standards for both language and academic content, large-scale and classroom measures, and information for accountability, as well as curriculum and instructions. So we use standards. We use standards for content, and they're given to you by each subject. We have the ELA, the Math Common Core standards. We have the Gen Science standards, Social Studies, and National Association standards. We also use standards for language, and for each of your states, you should look into the English as ESL, English as Second Language standards. Some states default to the ELA standards, but there has to be some specifications. And finally, there is standards for sociocultural competence. Some schools adopt the standards for social justice, others adopt standards for cultural competence, and we will talk more about that at a later time. So the argument that Dr. Medina, which this is one of his slides, makes about learning targets is that if we just have the standards, the abbreviation for the standards, we will not be able to give ownership to ourselves and to the students of the learning target for each lesson. And therefore, we will not be, or we will be ill-equipped to really assess that specific skill through formative assessments, because formative assessments target specific skills most of the times. So we therefore create the three targets for each lesson: content learning target, language learning target, and culture learning target. Many teachers are just learning to do the culture learning target. The content learning targets have been in place for a long time, and language learning target is something that we will zoom in to and become masters of this during the last two courses. And I will be also introducing the culture learning target. You can pause the slide now and read the definitions, research, or email me if you have further questions. So in an early childhood education class, while the content standard would have to do with students learning to write their name, for example, in pre-K, the language learning target is when we focus on three different steps that make this learning very concrete language-wise. So you choose an action verb, so I can write, and then you make explicit connection to the content, which is I can write my name, and then you the final step is to include interaction with text, partner, group, or others. So I can write my name by tracing it. For example, in this case, it could be through a graphic or a line. It could be also by the end of the year, I can read my classmate's name and rotate and read it back to them, etc. We will cover this much more in depth. Now, we can see as well what a language learning target would look like in secondary. So this is mathematics, and the content connection has to do with ratios, so they're learning ratios. So in language target, you could say, I can orally summarize how to express a ratio using the provided language stem, and you would have to determine which language stems. They might not need the language stems if they're not English learners, but you can say, you can report orally what the language, the ratio is, or you could also represent it in a different modality. Now there's an optional fourth step that makes it even more specific. So you can see here, first we choose an action verb connected to the 4+1. It has to be with the modalities. When it talks about 4+1, we'll talk more about that, or you can Google it, the speaking, reading, writing, and listening. So in this case, I can orally describe a geometric shape because we're making explicit connection to the content language learning target in the second step, and to a partner, because in the third step we're including interaction with text, partner group, others, graphics, etc. But finally, we could say as step 4, using triangle and angle, using the specific terms, for example. So you can actually include the specific new words that they will use while they're orally talking to each other, or the language function that it's key for their own, to be able to express the content. Is the case, for example, with compare and contrast, inferring. There are specific language functions that you need to use for those cognitive processes, so you could also include them at this point as part of the learning target. And this ability to write learning targets based on standards is key, because it's based on those learning targets that you'll be able to do your formative assessment. So you have your objectives. So if you want to do a formative assessment at the end of the unit, you simply look back at all your objectives and how and what were the language objectives, and you can choose among them or do a summative of all of them as part of your formative process, to inform you if the students are ready to move on, or if you need to review any information, or who's having particular difficulty with a specific concept or the language of the concept. So typically the question that arises from this is, so how do I make a distinction between testing my students to see if they know the content or if they know the language? So one of the ways to do this is to include visual or sensory aspects, graphics, or interactive ways. So when you add this language scaffolding, you bypass the language omission or the language challenge to really be able to assess if the students get the content or not. So formative assessments are not optional. They are very important. They inform, enrich, and often are embedded in instruction. Generally classroom-based, helps closely monitor individual student progress, provides immediate feedback to students, parents, and other teachers. And pay attention to this. Let's pay attention to this because we're going to talk about self-assessment for students, and for the most part contribute to low-stake decisions such as grouping and differentiating instruction. So let's talk about those 4 modalities: the listening, speaking, reading, and writing, which are the venues that we choose as part of our language objective and also to assess. So listening and speaking naturally interact. Receptive language of English language learners often exceeds that of productive language. That is, their processing of language is greater than their ability to express it. We know this. So the first step is the receptive aspect before the productive. And at times it is important to use instructional assessment techniques that are geared to listening, therefore. So Gottlieb proposes these listening activities for assessment: to follow simple to complex oral commands by pointing or through movement, to respond to non-verbally to a sequence of oral commands, The role play or reenact events in a story or passage read orally, or draw representations described orally. These are 4 more: to construct models, maps, timelines, and figures from oral directions, to sort illustrations or illustrations with text based on oral descriptions, to the sequence illustrations based on oral discourse, to complete graphic organizers or construct charts, graphs, tables from oral stimuli. The second receptive modality is speaking, and speaking is a two-way communicative act, else bilingual learners should have opportunities to interact with many language models, and therefore they need ample opportunities to practice their new language with peers, older students, teachers, and other adults. Gottlieb proposes many activities to assess through speaking. One is to engage in two-way tasks with partners, participate in literature circles in small groups. This is very common in secondary, where you pose questions and you let the students discuss the topics, give oral reports in small groups or whole class, debate issues in teams. Here are some more. My suggestion is that if any of them strikes a chord, to Google them, because there's many examples through images or through videos online of these and any of the others for listening as well. So the third and fourth modalities are the productive piece, the reading and the writing, which is more challenging, or a second step for bilingual learners. They need to be exposed to multiple text types and genres across the content areas, and to other reasons that you're already familiar with. Negotiating expository text is as important in this day and age as appreciating literature, and therefore reading strategies need to be incorporated across the curriculum, as comprehension of text is key to academic success. And the same for preschool, when they're familiarizing themselves with phonemic awareness and with print. Gottlieb proposes these 4 activities as a way to assess through reading: access and sort information from word, phrase walls, environmental print, or visually supported text, sequence a series of pictures, sentences, or paragraphs, highlight main ideas and details with color markers, and match illustrations to word, phrase banks, sentences, or paragraphs. Finally, writing. Bilingual learners need writing models and graphic organizers to produce and arrange text independently. It generally takes more time for writing to develop than other language domains, and that's in English typical. In Spanish it can change, actually. Therefore, concentrate on teaching bilingual learners how to communicate their message to an audience. And I say can change because in Spanish we learn reading and writing together, and actually writing facilitates reading. And in English we've been seeing that the same can be used when we take a text apart through reading and then we go ahead and writing, we become better readers. Gottlieb proposes these 5 activities as a way to use writing as assessment: to recap main ideas and details or provide examples in writing, compare and contrast characters, events, places, people, or issues, and it can be in writing or through diagrams depending on the stage, to use multimedia to explain the process of or present a point of view. Once again, it could be through drawings if they're little, design brochures, newsletters, pamphlets, or compose emails, ads, editorials, letters, and stories. So many of the activities that Gottlieb mentions and that we spoke about in the learning targets at the beginning are simply tasks that we include in order to convey or accomplish the learning target, right? So you would say, well, what's the difference between those activities or projects or tasks that I do in the class? Task being a specific smaller action, activity involves several tasks, and project involves many activities usually. So what is the difference between simply doing that as part of your instructional component and using all that for assessment? Because that's right, you can use all of those tasks, activities, and projects as assessments as simultaneously, so you don't have to make up other assessments other than the ones you already use for instruction. So why do we call some of those assessments? And the difference is that you actually document what you see or what you read that the student produced. So that is the main difference between a task or an activity or a project and the assessment within the four modalities. So instruction extends into assessment when there is a form or scoring guide to document what students do. And there are many ways to record the performance of ELS. We'll talk about some of them. Another legitimate question is, do I need to differentiate for language, not only for, or for content, not only for language in assessment? So the answer is we differentiate for language. So the content should be the same, grade level. It should not be watered down or simplified. It should be amplified through different language opportunities. So you can read those two tasks and pause and think of which of the two actually assesses for language and which one assesses for content. And it's very important to be able to identify this. If you're not able to, feel free to take note of it, to email me about it so we can discuss it. This distinction is at the core of us differentiating for bilingual learners. So we need to be able to assess the same content, modifying the language for all learners. This is simply a visual representation of how we have both standards for content, standards for language. We teach the same standards. We can change the standards for language depending on where the students are at, and then how they both interact during instruction and during assessment, but we can still differentiate them. So let's take it where we left a few slides ago about using instructional moments as formative assessments. So in planning a lesson, we select indicators from language proficiency and academic content standards, always. We formulate content and language objectives differentiated by students' language proficiency levels. And then we match the content and the language to tasks or projects that we want to carry on for instruction. We then develop and align assessment measures, and we select or adapt documentation forms so that we can turn our instruction into assessments. So some of these documentation forms can be not only, there could be many more, but some ways to do it is through rubrics, checklists, scales, and matrices. So checklists are the easiest ones for students to use for self-assessment, sometimes scales as well. And matrices are the typical ones that we use to actually check oral proficiency when we are observing students interact in groups or in pairs. This is an example of how students can use this checklist that we turned into actually a three alternative or 3-point scale. So when listening to English, I understand assignments from my teachers, news on TV, information from videos, humor or jokes, and they can check if they do it not so well, quite well, or great. We can't talk enough about the importance of giving ownership to the students of the learning targets. So even if they are 3 and 4, they should know what they will be able to do by the end of that day, and they should celebrate it. These are examples of what we can use, some icons that we can use at different grade levels to give students ownership of what is being required from them and what is being assessed. So the students as young as you can see here, they are already understanding if they're which modality they're going to be using. So this is a slide to bring everything together, hopefully, and kind of wrap it up before we talk about our objectives for today. So the formative assessments entail, first, clear lesson objectives that the students own. And this implies knowledge of content and language standards on your part, or on the teacher's part, knowledge of how to create 3 types of objectives, a knowledge of which tasks fulfill my objectives, and then to create expectations of how they will assess themselves, students, since the beginning, so they know since the beginning of the lesson. And finally, it entails self and teacher documentation, which implies for a teacher knowing what they're going to be using. Is it rubrics? And there's 3 types of rubrics. You can Google it. There's a lot of information about them online. Checklist, which is what I have been using in this course with you and students are used to using for self-assessment. Scales and matrices. Scale usually involves agree, disagree, little, too much, 3, so 2 or 3, 4 options. And then matrices, there's the most common one in terms of language development is it's called the Solemn Student Oral Language Observation Matrix, and you can also find it online. This concludes our e-lecture for today, and I'm hoping that we fulfill our objectives. Participants will learn a concrete way to design formative classroom assessments. I hope that by understanding or reflecting about our target languages and then how to document the different tasks or projects that we've accomplished, that the first objective, participants will review and retell basic principles to keep in mind when planning for bilingual learners assessment. And that we covered mainly at the beginning when we talked about the philosophical context and also when we talked about the three aspects that should be included in assessing bilingual learners. Thank you very much, and as always, let's put this into practice and contact me if you have any questions. Thank you.